Thank you, Brittany. And people watching us on the stream, I promise you, we are not exaggerating, you're going to be blown away when you finally see the documentary. So welcome everyone, welcome to the second and unfortunately last day of the Language Creation Conference. I hope you all managed to get some rest and all fresh and to start again. Won't be long. We have still a few interesting presentations, a panel later after lunch, and of course we'll finish with the reveal of the Language Creation Conference relay. So, but without further ado, we will start with our first presentation of the day about the sociolinguistic aspects of conlanging, because as I heard someone say yesterday, all conlangers are word builders. Even any language reflects the culture of its speakers. Even the heartland reflects the inner workings of the person who creates this. So we all create words when we create conlangers, and this part is also an interesting thing to look at. So Margaret, Ransdell-Green, I'll let you start.
Okay. Thank you. So yeah, today I'm going to be talking about some of the more sociolinguistic aspects of conlangs and how they developed in tandem with the constructed world setting, and mostly how those cultures reflected onto the linguistic systems themselves and how that ended up really forming and reshaping the languages. So the context that we're looking at here is on the planet of Einith, and so here is the globe of it. There's a spinning version, but it didn't fit into this media format. Some background with this. Einith was born around like the turn of the millennium, give or take, alongside the languages. It was originally created so that my languages wouldn't be speakerless. I didn't want them to be without a sort of a living context. So these things developed side by side, and as such, the other aspects of the world really became more fleshed out over time. So things like history, politics, culture, even things like botany, archaeology, all sorts of things in the world setting really flourished alongside all these languages. But of course, the language building itself is still pretty central, and then there's about 7 of them in the works, give or take, varying degrees of development. So the 7 main language projects are here. I'm going to be talking mostly about Tulsi, the second one, and then Greenland, in comparing the sociolinguistic aspects of these 2 very different languages and cultures. So here is the map. So the Greenland territory is up in the north of this continent called Izoi, in the green, and the Tulsi Empire is in red down there. So those are the main ones that we're focusing on. They have a unique relationship from a sociolinguistic perspective, generally because of their sort of tumultuous relationship in this world setting and the way that that tumultuous relationship has shaped the languages themselves over time. So Tulsi, starting out first, the culture is designed to be matriarchal as well as matrilineal, and basically the way they function is they have an expansive empire. Its main interests are expanding its territories and gathering resources from neighboring peoples in order to expand their territories. So it's very expansionist in nature. They have an absolute monarchy with some theocratic elements going on, so there's kind of a strict social stratus, in effect. And essentially, part of the story is that the Tulsi are invading the Greenland homelands, and so there's this conflict that causes things to happen, basically. Because the Tulsi culture is so strictly gender divided and matriarchal and rigid like that, that's basically, you can see it in the language. So not only are there third person gender distinctions, but you get gender distinctions throughout all of the personal pronouns, right? So even in the first person, right? You cannot even say I without indicating your gender, right? Male or female, it's very strict. So everyone knows, right? The moment you start speaking, the moment you refer to anyone, the moment you talk to somebody, it's all very like explicitly laid out. So some examples of this. So using third person plural, you for plural feminine, or ben, right, for masculine. There's also this option of using a special prefix on verbs as well that indicates that the subject of the verb are male or masculine. But it's been fallen out of use in the lower and middle classes, and mostly is an upper class thing used amongst the nobility in order to kind of have sort of a power play thing going on. So it draws attention to the fact that whoever it is you're talking about are men, not women. So some looking at the first person use of na versus ne. So you all automatically know whoever's speaking, even if it's written, you know automatically. One thing I should note is that the na agreement on the verbs is never used by men themselves. It's only used by women in reference to men or speaking to men or about them. So it is not something you would hear amongst men speaking to each other or about each other. It's something used by the women to draw attention to the fact that this is who the subject is. So another thing that shows the kind of stricter social stratification in the Tulsi society is these honorific particles. And there's a whole series of these that show basically whatever the speaker's attitude is towards someone they're talking about or talking to. And it's not just sort of like friendly, respect, whatever. There's not like just a couple. It's got a like a system. So there's a whole bunch. So depending on the exact shade of attitude toward whoever you're speaking to, you can use these particles, and you can use them just openly in the sentence. You can just put them at the end of your sentence. You can put them at the beginning as if you were addressing that person. So there's a few here, and a lot of them have to do with relationships of like power. So a younger woman to an older woman, somebody who's in an inferior position to a superior position, or someone to their mother, to a parent, something like that. Some others. Different ones used by different people of different genders. So you have younger women used by their mothers, right? Or women used by their to their sons. But because of the nature of the pretty strictly matriarchal system, a lot of times these things can become pejorative over time, right? And so it's not necessarily a compliment to call someone Vazmi, my little son, right? It's not necessarily a good thing anymore. So quite a few of these are possible. So some examples of the honorifics working. So my heart is heavy with this knowledge, and there's no way to translate goof at the end. It's an attitudinal marker toward the addressee. So some kind of concerned or protected attitude toward whoever you're speaking to. Obviously, the speaker of this sentence would be female, using the na pronoun for the female first person. You can also use them attached to people's names. So, so, are you going to the spring? Ateng. So, calling Ateng fi indicates that you are feeling friendly toward Ateng. Yeah, so comparing this to Reeland culture, by contrast, is pretty different. Traditionally, Reeland culture, before they came in contact with the Tulsi and had all kinds of problems, they were pretty egalitarian. They were very isolationist. They did not want anything to do with anyone else. And they were very pacifistic. They didn't engage in warfare. They lived in dense forests, which mostly protected them. There were some poisonous flora that was kind of helping them out and keeping them isolationist. But the Tulsi Empire moved in looking for resources, mostly wood from the forest, and then things started to have problems. So because this is an unprecedented crisis in the Reeland society, there was like a huge rift. It was known as the Flight. So basically, the Reeland split into two groups. One group deciding, okay, well, we're gonna have to stay and fight and defend our home. And the other group said, no, we're getting out of here. And they went north to a series of caves where the forest was much denser under a mountain. And they decided that they would not be engaging in this fight. So that was known as the flight. And so these two groups, the Sunuli and the Lunawi, because of this rift in their society, had divergent paths after this point. And so their languages are going to reflect that too. What happens? What are the two separate destinies of these two groups? The Lunawi retained their sort of pacifistic ways, but their society became more stratified, more hierarchical. Whereas the Sunuli, who stayed and fought, kind of maintained more of an egalitarian system. Right, so what happens to the Reelan language after this split, after this rift? The dialects mostly differ in terms of the phonemic inventory, so sound changes brought them apart. There's also some differences in the way that the verbs are used to show social stratification or lack thereof. And you also have different lexicon that the group of really who stayed and fought created by their trade relationships with their allies. So some phonological differences. Some phonemic distinctions were lost in the Lunawi dialect. So you end up having, so these fricatives, right, they're all merging into just the F and V versions rather than the P and the. So you have, basically, you have some homophones that are created because of this, like this. So, yep. So some phonological differences. Other were in the grammar. So a long time ago, Reelan used affixes on their verbs to indicate degrees of familiarity with whoever they were talking to or about. And as the society was becoming more egalitarian, the system of using these broke down so that it was not so strict any longer. When the Reelan that went to the north and decided to flee and not fight, they created a more stratified society once again. So these affixes come back into use. So here are the pronouns, pronominal endings that you can see. So first degree basically indicates the most familiar with whoever you're talking about or to. And then third degree is the least familiar. So in the group of the Reelan that is more socially stratified, that is not quite as egalitarian or leveled out, these came back into use a whole lot more. In the Sunuli dialect, it's basically you just use the first degree. You don't have to worry about degree familiarity. Some other aspects of the Sunuli dialect of Reelan that changed were borrowed words from other languages. So because they had to start creating an army and creating more resources and creating defenses, they created a lot of trade alliances with surrounding peoples. And therefore they got some borrowed concepts, borrowed items, material culture that they may not have had before. They came into the language and changed the lexicon. So some examples from Gotevi, or Gotevian. Items or concepts or things in general that were Gotevian that came into the Reelan culture. Things like cigarettes, tobacco, certain types of travel, right? So like anything related to boats, sailing was not inherently Reelan in the forests. So things like that came into the Reelan languages and then changed to fit the phonological nature of the Reelan language. So instead of hefe, you get ete, or enta changed not much. You get naiblinier to nailini. So as per the phonological constraints of Reelan, their loan words are changing. Some more of these, things like eyeglasses, types of onions, lutes, syringes, and sometimes the semantic category is not exactly the same any longer. So down here you see tine at the bottom for skirt, which was a Gotevian word for skirt. It became more specified, more semantically narrowed. So specifically Quariosian style of skirt from that continent, not just any skirt. Likewise with Plunithent, Batavian currency, it doesn't mean Batavian currency any longer, but just sort of a tip or change. Yeah, so there are some semantic category changes going on here. So in conclusion, the sociolinguistics aspects of these languages are some of the most fascinating to me because it really allows me to build them not just side by side, but just into each other so that they can influence each other and in turn make each other richer. And so whenever I work on the language, it inspires me to do something in the world and vice versa. And it also led me to study not only things like linguistics and language that are obviously really relevant to conlanging, but also other areas that might not be as obvious, but are really advantageous when you're building a constructed world, like politics, sociology, anthropology, all kinds of areas like that eventually became pertinent, and I feel really enriched the whole experience for me. So because they're so closely tied together, in the real life, in real world, as well as in these constructed world, I feel like there's a real chance to have something that is ultimately more than the sum of its parts between culture and language and can come together and make something that's a lot more enjoyable, at least for me to create. So yeah, thanks.
Two questions.
Yeah.
Is this part of planned literature or other art early time, or is this world building just purely world building?
It is not purely world building. It used to be less pure. I had a series of novel-length writings about it that I haven't worked on for like 10 years, so it's been a while. But I'm going to take that back up and edit them and kind of rework everything. I also do music and composition, so I've composed and performed music in Reelin. So if anybody wants to hear that, I have the recording, but I didn't fit it into this, really. So it kind of is related to a lot of other things. I also used to do metalsmithing, so a lot of the Reelin sort of visual and material culture made it into that as well. Yeah.
And then for the gendered, that prefix,
Nah, oh yeah.
nah, what happens if a man is reporting it was a woman? Sorry, this is a question that actually
That's
happens
a
in
really good
languages
question.
where they use this sort of gender.
Yeah, in reported speech.
Yeah.
It depends on if he's being very precise and wants to say exactly, okay, this is her words exactly, or if he's like paraphrasing, and if he's paraphrasing, he would not use that. It would be weird to use that, I feel. But if it's like a quote, like she said, blah, 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 then yeah, he would leave it. So, yeah, good question. Yeah.
So I'm interested in that, in the gender-heavy pronoun system.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how it handles mixed gender groups.
Right. Yeah, very good question. The Tosi world is not very forgiving, let's just say. They're not exactly like super fair. But it exists, right, in any culture. If you have a mixed gender group, it's usually going to be gendered as female, if there's females. If there are genders other than male or female, like third gender, it depends on the speaker, right? Because Tosi society is not super like nice, so they're not going to be like really nice and fair. But
it seems like they almost force you to choose one.
they do. It's really a strict thing, and you know they have this authoritarian society, and it's just And so yeah, that's a good question. Is what do you do if you don't fit into the box? I don't know. That's a good question. It's probably not pleasant. Yeah. Yes.
I'm taken by your Greek suffix system, which came back.
Right.
It's already there, and it preserved it.
It came back. It was preserved in writing. Yeah. So basically, in the ancient days, it was like feudal society, and they had these suffixes that indicated higher or lower station. It was all very planned out and solid. And then it became more egalitarian. They fell out of use, and then this crisis happened. They split into two groups. One became like, oh no, we have to make a hugely stratified society. We have to have a hierarchy. We're going to fall apart. And so these things came back into use because they had those writings.
Explicitly identified as something returning to our
Yeah, they're like,
glory service.
We have to go back to this system or we're going to die, basically. Anyway, yeah.
So would it be somewhat analogous to use of like artificial usage of like thou and thee in modern? It's not natural for modern English speakers, but it's intelligible at least to educated.
Yeah, it's kind of like that. It would be weird at first, but then you would get used to it. It was kind of like a forced thing, like they consciously did it.
Mhm.
It wasn't just like they just sort of casually went back to it,
Yeah.
because it wasn't natural for that generation at all. So, yeah.
I have a request and a question from IRC. So
Yeah.
just wondering if you can repeat the question ahead of time, just because I can't always hear or.
Oh yeah, sorry.
And
Yeah.
I'm trying to type frantically. So
No,
yeah,
no.
repeat the question from people on the internet. I do have a question from IRC. Why did the breakaway agreement provide old familiarity forms rather than creating new ones?
So it's kind of, it depends on which group you're talking about. The ones that went north into the caves and decided to hide and not fight, they reverted to older forms as a way of kind of consciously trying to go back to an older way to sort of preserve their basic existence / society. The group that innovated and decided to develop an army and become defensive and engage with the Tulsi invaders, they had much more innovation, as you can see with the new loanwords and things like that. So the older group, it was really just sort of a coping mechanism that they consciously did.
I find it interesting how the two groups of the Reelan,
Yeah.
the group that decided to fight was called the
Sunuli, yeah.
And the group that decided to hide,
Lunali, yeah.
Lunali.
Yeah.
It's funny because the Sunali, they're in the sun, and the Lunali, they hide in like the darkness.
That's true. That's totally unintentional, you're right. Yeah.
I'm interested in these attitudinal suffixes. What happens if you leave them out? If you do not add it? Because
On the Reelan words,
yes,
you have to have an
actually doing
ending.
the,
You have to have a pronominal suffix. It's obligatory in language.
in some of these languages that have evidence morphemes and that sort of thing, it's written into the grammar, and you have a suffix. If you leave it out, is it considered terribly rude?
No one would ever say it. It's sort of like in Latin. You can leave off the ending, right? You just can't. Like it would be
Well, that's really
incomplete. You'd have to choose which one you use, right? But you have to use something.
If you say "me don't know," it's not rude. It's just no one can ever say it.
Okay.
Okay, in the Tosi society, how would they, with regards to the pronominal system, how do they handle gender fluid situations?
That's a good question. So it kind of relates to my answer to another question over here, which is their society is not very accepting of things like that. But amongst people who are like that, they would probably choose one. It's possible that they could create a new one, as people have done in our society. It's not something that I've explored a whole lot in that particular culture. But yeah, I would say like the status quo is not very like nice.
I got the sense
They're pretty
when
strict.
you said they're not nice.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
Why is it that the sort of faction that continued to be pacifistic and fled rather than engaging in fighting was the one that became more socially stratified?
I think that was kind of a reactionary thing that happened to the crisis because they felt like they had no way of dealing with what had happened and that they ran away. They kind of reverted into something. It was like an ultra defensive mode, and for some reason for them that was going back to a former way of being. Whereas the ones that had a method of actually engaging with this problem didn't do that. So yeah.
I'm curious, the Tosi society, the morphology of the language is very gender specific and stratified, and it's matrilineal society and a matriarchy. But I didn't get clear, who's the ruling class? Is the ruling class also gender stratified? In other words, is this a woman-run society? Who's making all these
So there is one
war-oriented decisions?
Right. So there's a central empress for the empire, and there are various levels of nobility that are led by the females in society.
So you're saying it's the females who have this war-making impulse in the ruling class?
Yes.
Who fights?
Yes. I mean, in the actual warfare, they have both genders fighting, but yeah. Yes.
I'm going to take a step back from your actual society and look over a piece of it that is in your middle paragraph up there that I think is really cool, and might actually like you to give another couple of sentences about, and that's all the other areas that you had to at least touch on in your studies and just get a little bit. It's sort of like that old term of the Renaissance man, who's got to know a little bit about everything in order to make a proper picture. And I'd love to hear a little more about how you.
Oh yeah, that just over time, I just started through self-study and through classes that I took on the topics in order to have some idea of how these work in human society, so that I like my things to be fantastical and interesting, but also logically plausible and not just ridiculous and silly. So I wanted to know how these things work for humans, so I could get some inspiration from humans and see how it might work for another humanoid species.
Are the reelin physically similar to humans?
No, they are. Well, they're both. It's a good question. They're all humanoid. The reelin are small and have grayish skin and different kinds of colored hair. But yeah, yeah.
I found it interesting that you handled polarities by separating them. One culture is this and the other one is the opposite, and they split, and they're, it's like it turns into opposites.
Uh-huh.
I'm wondering if you have any plans to, have them have to deal with their opposites.
You mean with each other?
Within
the
a
culture.
single culture.
Yeah, there is stuff like that going on in the Tosi right now in my developments. There's some weird internal conflict. So yeah, okay, I'm being told to stop. So thank you. And there's a website that I've built pretty extensively about this stuff and all the other people. So if anybody's interested, please let me know and I'll give you the URL.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Really interesting. And now, once again, something completely different. Most of you know about linguistics, even if not every one of us are linguists. I am not, for instance. But as somebody who's very interested in linguistics, I know about the tradition of Manini, the Sanskrit tradition from India a long time ago, and of course, modern linguistics.